Good afternoon, everyone. As Scott mentioned, my name is Betsy Rosenblatt Beck, and I'm the Director of Transmission Policy at the American Wind Energy Association. Before we dive into the fun stuff, I just have to get my little caveat out of the way that this presentation represents my views and not necessarily the views of the trade association, which has over 700 members, or any one of our individual companies. So part of the reason that I'm excited to be here today presenting is that I'd like to present a little bit more of what I see as kind of the real perspective on these issues that I deal with every day in advocating for clean energy on the ground across America. And so, I think it's really important that we have our academic perspective here today, but I also want to provide a little bit of the real perspective and part of the arguments that I see that they're very important for us to make as we talk about this big vision for the future. So, as I mentioned, I'm not an academic, and so the way I like to think about the challenges of developing clean energy and transmission, I like to think a little bit about the food sector, something that we all understand. And in particular, I like to analogize this a little bit to bacon. I am from Iowa, after all. In case you have not been as deep in the food scene in Washington as I have over the past few years, you might have noticed that bacon now seems to be on menus everywhere. There's Brussels sprouts with bacon, burgers with bacon, French fries cooked in bacon fat. It's everywhere. But we obviously haven't seen pigs wandering around Washington, which I can tell you is a good... Uh-oh, okay, well...
Different analogy.
I will leave that there. But I contend that this is a good thing because having grown up in Iowa, I can tell you having a hog confinement in your backyard down the street is not something that is particularly desirable. So obviously, this is part of our food system. Our food is not really sourced from where it's consumed, whether that be bacon, which of course all comes from Iowa, in DC, or the food that we consume in Iowa where I grew up. Iowa is known for growing great commodities like bacon and soybeans and corn, but we don't grow a lot of our fresh produce there. And so we obviously import a lot of that from thousands of miles away. My avocados come from Mexico, my fruit comes from California, and for some reason all my blueberries seem to come from Peru. And so obviously, our delivery of clean energy in our electric sector is a lot like our food sector, but we are much further ahead on the delivery of food than we are in the delivery of clean energy in this country because we've invested, and we've invested in the infrastructure over the decades, and we've had innovation and innovative leaders who have helped bring us to where we are today, where we can get fresh fruit year-round in any part of the country, and I can order it on my smartphone from Amazon Fresh, and it's in my refrigerator when I get home. And again, this has been as a result of the fact that we've invested in infrastructure, and we've had companies and policies that have given us space to innovate in this space and come up with creative solutions. So again, this brings me back to clean energy, and the reason why it's important for us to think about the solutions to clean energy delivery in the United States. It's not that hard to understand why the challenge, as Sandy discussed, is how do we get clean energy from the central part of the country and the sunny parts of the country to consumers. But the real question is, why do we need a national grid? Why isn't a grid that's grown up the way it has so far in sort of small bottom-up ways, why isn't that the solution? Why do we need a big vision? Why do we need a national grid and not just regional grids to get us there? And why does that grid need to be a high voltage grid? And why is that part of the best solution? So obviously Sandy touched on it briefly, but wind and solar are the best pathway to get us to decarbonization and cost-effective clean energy. The latest numbers, they come out year after year. This is, again, some numbers from Lazard showing that the costs of wind and solar are dramatically decreasing. Over the past 8 years, the cost of wind, the LCOE, or the delivered cost of wind, has come down 67% for wind over the past 8 years and 87% for solar. The costs are now competitive, as Sandy showed, with all other types of generation on a $1 per megawatt hour basis. So beyond our desires for decarbonization and clean energy, the fact of the matter is renewable energy resources are now cost competitive alone. So turning back to the decarbonization point, why then are wind and solar the best pathway to decarbonization, in addition to the fact that it's already becoming a cost-effective source of energy delivery? If you look at this map, you can see a map of the United States, and the shading of the states and regions shows the carbon intensity of the electric generation fleet in those regions. So and then the two bars, it looks white on here, but the lighter gray or white bar shows the avoided carbon emissions that have already resulted, this is a 2015 generation map, have already resulted from wind, and then the darker gray bar shows the carbon emissions that have already been avoided from solar. So as you can see, we've already gone a long ways and had huge advancements and success in carbon emission reductions in certain regions of the country, in particular in regions that have extremely high carbon intensity of their electric generation fleet. Places in the Midwest where they're still burning a lot of coal happen to be the places where the wind is the cheapest and the wind blows the strongest. So we've seen the success there. In the Southeast, you'll see that there's actually already been carbon emissions avoided from wind development. But if you know anything about the wind industry, you know that there's not actually very good wind resources in the Southeast, and there really isn't any development to date in the Southeast. We think that it's coming with new technology, taller turbines, longer blades, but it hasn't happened yet. So the reason that you see this carbon emission reduction in the Southeast from wind is because of the transmission that's been built and the ability of entities like Southern Company and TVA to wheel that power from the Midwest into the Southeast. But as you can see from this chart, we still have a long ways to go, and the ability to wheel power, with a lot of losses that go along with it, is not the most effective way to bring those cheap and reliable clean energy resources from the central part of the country further to the coast, further to the Southeast, further to the Northwest, where we do need to see significant more amounts of decarbonization in the generation fleet. So, as I mentioned, I want to provide a little bit of color on why this is important, why we shouldn't just be sitting here in Washington as academics and policy thinkers talking about what this future looks like, but why it's really meaningful to people across America and what the value of this brings beyond just carbon emissions and avoiding climate change. So I've got a picture here of a woman, Kristen, who's a wind turbine technician. So wind turbine technicians and solar panel installers, according to the latest numbers out of the Bureau of Labor and Statistics, are the two fastest growing jobs in America. They're expected to more than double over the next 10 years. There are currently over 100,000 wind workers in America and over 200,000 solar workers in America. And these jobs are cool jobs. These are awesome jobs. You get to be outside on top of a turbine every day. You need to not be afraid of heights, but these are the jobs of the future, and these are the local jobs, these American jobs this industry is creating. But you don't just have to be a wind turbine technician to benefit from the investment that's going into the clean energy industry. There's also been huge investments in the manufacturing sector of clean energy in the United States. So investments in developing wind power in the Midwest has resulted in a manufacturing boom as well. Obviously, transportation logistics, getting the parts to where the wind farms are going to be built is a huge cost and important piece of the supply chain. And so folks like this guy who works at a tower manufacturing facility in Minnesota, they're now having jobs in the wind industry as well. And one thing I love to point out about this photo, which you can actually see a little bit because the screen is so big, but on top of this welder's welding mask, it actually says, "Make America Great Again." This is an avid Trump supporter and Trump voter who works in the wind industry and who does not care about, the carbon emissions associated with building clean energy or climate change. He cares about jobs and the impact to his community and his livelihood. And that's one of the sort of underappreciated values of investing in clean energy in the United States is it's bringing value to Americans, jobs, manufacturing across the country and in people in places we may not expect. Another one of the huge benefits of the fact that these resources are located in geographically rural and faraway places is the fact that investment in clean energy in rural communities means a lot more than just the jobs in manufacturing. It also means a lot to the broader communities and to the landowners who house these projects on their land. A recent study that Navigant did found that over the next 5 years, over $85 billion of economic development will result in rural America as a result of the wind industry's investments there. So folks like this rancher, they receive payments, monthly payments for just housing these resources on their land. And this has been a huge asset to these rural communities because it provides a stable income from them. They're no longer having to have as much concern about what beef prices are next week, next year, or corn prices or bean prices in Iowa, like my family worries about, because they have these stable incomes that they can depend on, which takes the pressure off farming, and ultimately has allowed them, a lot of folks like this gentleman, to keep their family farms in their family. So when we think about how to talk about why transmission and why this grid is important and what clean energy does for the country, we have to think about all these different perspectives and all these benefits that are accruing to Americans who, aren't necessarily worried about sea level rise out there in Montana, or smog or dirty air when they live out on ranches. So to get back to the nitty-gritty a little bit, we know that wind and solar are the solution. They're the most cost-effective way for carbon emissions, and they're the cheapest form of electricity going forward. So why do we need this grid? This big grid that's no longer this AC point-to-point grid, but really a national integrated grid, as Sandy discussed. Well, the reason is because there's huge benefits that are gained when you've got geographic diversity and a larger fleet to balance out the variability and uncertainty of these resources. So obviously, wind resources, north, south, east, and west, have significant different generation profiles. And over the past 35 years that this industry has existed, we've gotten really good at forecasting this variability. But by adding in this national transmission grid, it wipes out a lot of this variability and uncertainty, and it allows the generation output to be more consistent and more predictable. As we increase the size of the footprint, the geographic area of where the resources are located, and that ability to use the direct current to balance them. So, in addition, obviously, to the carbon benefits and the job and rural economic development benefits that a broader national grid would enable, here's some numbers looking at what the other health benefits of the clean energy investment that we've seen to date have been. We've seen huge benefits in health benefits in the reduction of pollutants. Obviously, this is another important message that we like to share with Americans across the country. Having cleaner air and really means real numbers, $8 billion of health benefits in 2015 alone. And once you add that national transmission grid into the mix, I expect that these benefits would explode significantly. And then we have to think about water consumption as well. This is just looking at the wind industry alone, you see over 86 billion gallons of water consumption avoided in 2016 just from the wind industry alone, which equates to over 225 or 250 gallons per person in the United States, because you're no longer losing that water to evaporation. Once you add in the benefits of a national supergrid and the benefits of avoided water consumption from all the diverse resources that will be part of this grid, you're going to see this number more than quadruple to over 400 billion gallons of water saved. And this is just water consumption saved. This does not take into account, water withdrawal that is used that can have effects on fishing and other wildlife. And again, it's important to recognize that wind and solar have already proven their ability to reduce carbon emissions effectively. And looking back at 2016, we saw a huge bump from 2015 to 2016, primarily, again, as a result of that investment and development in the central region where we have very carbon-intensive generation existing today. And as Sandy talked about, and you'll hear more about in the other presentations, the carbon emissions avoided from this national supergrid, which would enable better capacity factors from existing resources and so much more renewable energy development, is going to go off the charts. And one last thing that I wanted to mention was how investment in a national supergrid can help enable electrification of our vehicle fleet, which is a popular topic lots of folks like to think about now, but other things like water heaters as well. By having a more robust transmission and distribution grid and adding in policies like real-time pricing that can enable us to better utilize these resources, we will see an increase in the electrification of the transportation sector and other energy-intensive sectors. So once we get that infrastructure in place and we have lay on top the policies that will incent charging during times when, in California, we've got excess solar generation during the day, or in places like the Midwest, and we've got excess wind generation at night. When we can better balance that out across the country, we'll have better signals to electrify additional sectors of our economy. Let's see. All right. So two things, the most important I think to talk about while we're here today is about what are the policies that are going to get us there. As Sandy mentioned, technology is not the problem. These technologies exist today. We understand the challenges. We know where renewable energy is in one place. We need this system. We know HVDC needs to be part of it because it's cost effective and brings a lot of these additional benefits that we're talking about today. But why haven't we done it yet? Well, I contend that there's two things that we ultimately need to be able to take us to this national grid of the future. One, and most importantly, is federal leadership. As Sandy mentioned earlier, and Scott as well, we built the national highway system. We built the national railroad system. It's now time for the national electricity transmission system. We need this system to be something that's envisioned from the federal level. And we've seen a lot of challenges that entities have faced who have tried to build HVDC in this country over the past decade, and they've struggled. And they've struggled because the policies are not in place at the federal or state level to incentivize thinking about these challenges from a national level. We're thinking about these challenges today at a state and regional level, and we're not thinking about the problem as a national problem, which is not leading us towards a national solution. So the most important thing that we should take away is that we need national leadership on what this grid looks like to let us take not the next step, but the next frog leap to building this infrastructure out. And an important piece of that, as with building any sort of large infrastructure, is that we need a cooperation between the states and the federal government. There are obviously, we've got benefits that accrue to the regions where we'll see this generation development and benefits that accrue to the cities who will now have cleaner air and cheaper electricity as a result of this. So it's important for the states who are sort of the supply states and the demand states, and for the federal government to all come together to think about the value of investment in a national grid and the benefits and costs that accrue to different segments. And as I mentioned earlier, I think our messaging around this is really important. We can't just talk about the benefits of this for carbon and climate. We need to talk about the benefits for all Americans of all perspectives on this issue, because I really believe that there are significant benefits beyond that, and we need to talk about all of those to ensure that we can get a collective policy and Americans on board with this. So lastly, I just want to thank Sandy and Rachel and the team who's been doing so much work on this study over the past decades. I think that groundbreaking studies like this are exactly what we need to present that roadmap to our future. They're not just studies, they're a vision, and they're a vision for us all to work for. And while we may not get there in 5 or 10 years, I'm only 30, and what I've seen in you know, my lifetime, from getting that first desktop Mac computer to having a computer on my wrist. I truly believe that innovation will lead us towards this pathway. And I expect to see a DC national grid in my lifetime with, you know, 100% clean energy. So let's all keep working on it. And thanks again for all of you for being here today.
Excellent.